Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the shorter Malankya Sutra, which is one of the sutras from the Theravada Buddhist canon, which we call the Tripitaka, or which Buddhists call the Tripitaka. Tripitaka means three baskets, because in this collection, books are arranged into three sub-collections or smaller collections. First, there's the Vinaya Pitaka, and these are the books of monastic discipline. And then you have the Sutra Pitaka. These are the books of sermons and the books that explicate doctrine. And then you have the Abhidharma Pitaka, and these are the books of philosophy and psychology. Now, the contents of the Tripitaka were composed between the time of the Buddha and about 100 BCE, and they were handed on orally originally until finally somebody wrote them down, probably on palm leaves, somewhere between 100 BCE and 100 CE. It was composed in the Pali language, and so it is sometimes referred to as the Pali Canon. But since the Mahayana Buddhists also called their collection Tripitaka, this is kind of confusing because, in fact, these are completely different collections. So if you want to avoid confusion, then calling it the Pali Canon is probably the way to go. The Pali Canon is the longest collection of sacred scriptures in the world. When it's translated into English and printed, it runs about 40 volumes and over 20,000 pages. So that's a lot of scripture. But let's get back to our theme of crisis, and crisis as the driving force that causes people to write scriptures down. And let's figure out what's going on at the time of its writing. So up to now, the Buddha's teachings are being passed on orally, from mouth to mouth, from teacher to student. Of course, what happens when you pass things on orally? Every time you pass them on, it gets a little different. It's like the game of telephone. And so people felt, and some of the teachings that were emerging from some of these teachers seemed to lots of folks to be going pretty far astray from what the Buddha was actually teaching. And so there arose this kind of a gathering pressure to set things in stone, to write them down so as to preserve the fidelity to the Buddha's original teachings. Because already at the time that the sutras are, the earliest sutras are being written down, there are 5 early schools of Buddhism, and each of these schools each have different sects, and they all disagree with each other about what the Buddha meant about things. So there's this new diversity of teachings and interpretations and metaphysical speculations, and people are going from community to community and saying, what's the proper teaching? So that's a crisis. And it's the crisis that caused many of these folks to write down the teachings so that they would not be altered in transmission from teacher to student. So one of the things that distressed people most were the metaphysical speculations that were being made by some of these teachers. And so because, as you know, the Buddha was not big on metaphysical speculation. And the fact that the Buddha actually discouraged metaphysical speculation did not seem to be enough to stop later Buddhists from doing that metaphysical speculation. And this posed a crisis for the early community, who felt that the metaphysical speculations were getting out of hand and were distorting the Buddha's revelation, the Buddha's actual teaching. So let's explore some of these metaphysical speculations. And especially the heresies or wrong views that are being addressed in the Malankya Sutra. So in this sutra, we're encountering two teachings, one called eternalism and one called nihilism. So what exactly are these positions? So eternalism says that the self and the world are eternal, that they have always been here, they always will be here. Another kind of subset is partial eternalism, and this position says that the self and the world are both eternal and not eternal. So Brahma, from the Sanatana Dharma tradition, the Brahma is eternal, or mind or consciousness is eternal, but I and my body are not. So there are things that are eternal and things that are not eternal. And then, of course, there's nihilism, where nothing is real, nothing is eternal, and in the end, everything is just nothing. And both of these positions are problematic doctrinally for Buddhism and for these particular Buddhists who are writing down. Why might these new teachings be problematic? Let's look at a little grid here that might help us. So let's look at eternalism and nihilism, but also at what teachings could emerge from these two positions as we look at the Buddhist distinction between conventional reality and absolute reality, which, if you're familiar with Buddhism, is probably something that you have seen before, this distinction. So on the eternalism side of the spectrum, when you're looking at conventional reality, it seems that there is a solid, concrete reality that is as it appears, out there, and that might be all that there is. So this leads to a kind of materialism that is a distortion of the Buddha's views. And on the other hand, if you look at absolute reality, then the eternalist position could lead you to an unhealthy attachment to spirituality, or a belief in an actual soul that is eternal, or cause you to think that some of these metaphysical ideas are actual things, or actual eternal entities, or processes that have reality in their own being, in their own sense. And this too was seen as a distortion of the Buddhists' teaching. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people who are tending towards nihilism. And if you're looking at conventional reality, then this kind of belief leads to a disbelief in the mind, and a rejection of even the possibility for liberation. It also causes people to leap to an unhealthy reductionism of the teachings. And you see people do this all the time, where they just kind of offhandedly reduce a complex idea to something so that it's an absurdity that can simply be dismissed. But in fact, usually the ideas that are being reduced and dismissed are more complex ideas that really deserve a more careful and nuanced approach. On the other hand of nihilism, when we are considering absolute reality, it can lead to an attachment to meditative experiences, and a denigration of the conventional world, A view of the body as being worthless, or the earth or the world as being evil, or not worthy of respect or attention. And that can lead to some very unhealthy attitudes toward the body and towards other people as well. Now, our author is also addressing other questions in this text. One is regarding space. Is space finite or infinite? Is the self the body, or is the self not the body? And where does a sentient being go after death? Does it exist or does it not exist? So, all of these are dealing with one of these arms of the quadrant that we were looking at: eternalism or nihilism, conventional reality, absolute reality, and where do we come down on any of these things? So the author is writing this dialogue between the Buddha and Malankya-Buddha, and he is putting words in the Buddha's mouth that are addressing the crisis that are going on in the community at the time that he's writing. Specifically, these doctrinal crises. So he gets to basically write this scene where the Buddha, with all of the Buddha's authority, gets to speak to what the author sees as erroneous teachings going on in his own community at the time. So he is trying to solve a contemporary problem by depicting a scene in the past which probably did not happen just as he wrote it. As I said before, what a scripture writing is usually what a scripture writer is usually doing is telling a received story, but putting a spin on it so that it is speaking to the crisis that's going on in the scripture writer's own contemporary context. So, just what is this writer's strategy? How is he using theology to fix the problem in his community? Bhikkhu Vaga says, the unawakened monk Malankya-Buddha represents the modern intellectual who is more interested in speculative notions and philosophical arguments than in personal development and helping people helping. So, are there theological innovations in this text? Well, more like this text is trying to preserve and an earlier teaching and defend against innovations. It is innovative in that he is composing what is probably a new scene where we are imagining the Buddha speaking to the contemporary problem. So that's innovative. But now that this scene is written down, it is often taken literally by the people who come after it, and its authority spins out into the life of the religion and has far-reaching effects as the writing gains scriptural authority and power. So, how might Buddhism have developed differently if the doctrine of eternalism had prevailed, or the doctrine of nihilism had prevailed? It would have developed in quite different directions. And now, are there sects that have taken the Buddhist teaching in those directions? Well, yes, absolutely. Certainly, there are sects that have eternalist leanings and nihilist leanings. But the Buddha is the one who tries to hold to the middle way, and doesn't make these metaphysical speculations that come down on one side or the other, because they lead into kind of theological down theological trails that he wants his followers to avoid, and certainly this writer wants his community to avoid.